Democrats in the Senate are trying to pass a federal law that would make Election Day a national holiday, ensure access to early voting and mail-in ballots. This would supersede individual GOP-led state laws that they say are restricting easy voting access for millions of Americans. President Joe Biden going as far as to liken those states' changes to racist limitations imposed on African Americans in the Jim Crow era. At this time, it doesn't look like Democrats have enough votes, with two of their own voting against the bill. Joining me now to discuss is Professor David McCuan. Thank you for taking the time to join us to talk about this. So can we start with the state laws in question? I know they vary from a limit on voting by mail to having stricter ID and absentee ballot requirements. Republicans insisting that this is all in an effort to protect elections and boost voter confidence, but Democrats describe them as restrictive, even racist, and civil rights groups are backing their bill, taking MLK Day to publicly comment. So what do you make of all that?
Well, what we've seen is since the general election of 2020 and the aftermath of that, think of January 6th and what happened there, Republicans have moved, particularly at the state level, to put together stronger state laws that allow states to push back against the Electoral College, against what's happening in Washington, D.C. As Donald Trump has become such a preeminent figure within the Republican Party, there are a number of candidates running for governor, running for state attorney general, and running for secretary of state, the office that typically controls elections in most states, particularly in states that were critical during that 2020 election period. States like Georgia, states like Florida, states like Pennsylvania, and states like Arizona. So Republicans have tried to seed the water, if you will, to prevent what happened in 2020 from happening again in 2024. That's why Democrats are pushing so hard here, but also civil rights groups, as you talked about in the lead in here, for trying to do something at the federal level related to H.R. 1, related to the legacy of John Lewis, and obviously the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King.
And so we did see during those elections, things happen smoothly in states like Florida. So does that kind of give some sort of different alternative motive that that the Democrats in Congress right now might be pointing to, given that, okay, they are trying to establish fair elections, but in Florida nothing went wrong. So why are they changing any laws there?
Right. So it's important that you point to a state like Florida, because Florida is a perennial battleground state. It's the state where Donald Trump resides now. It's the state where if Donald Trump doesn't run for president in 2024, their governor, Ron DeSantis, would like to assume that mantle. He's an early favorite there, obviously. So what happens and turns up in Florida, even though they conducted the election fairly, that there's no evidence of fraud, that this occurred over multiple states, that Joe Biden, if you will, moved forward as the duly elected, lawfully elected president of the United States, none of that matters. None of that matters because Donald Trump controls the Republican Party and is going to push forward candidates on this narrative. Now, Democrats have an issue, and that is that if they can't get this to the floor and vote on this without changing the rules of the Senate, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen. There's going to be some futility for Democrats this week. So that means they're going to have to change the rules, look at this filibuster change. By doing that, it also puts some difficulty forward for a whole series of pieces of legislation. That could be problematic for Democrats later on, meaning if they lose the House and they lose the Senate in November, typically the in-party loses in the president's first midterm election, that could come back to haunt Democrats next year. If that comes to pass, that means Donald Trump is back on the national stage, and the actual mechanisms of voting, how we vote, what that looks like, all of that will become hugely important and won't become settled. And that drives civil rights groups and those that are for voting rights legislation. That drives them crazy because they want to see this move forward, especially in the wake and the legacy, again, of Dr. King.
So why are those voting laws in Republican-led states being compared, again, to something out of the Jim Crow era specifically? Is it that these Black Americans are living in the cities in question, in which maybe lines might be longer as a result of these voting restrictions, as the Democrats call them?
Right. And you also see, for example, in a lot of states, two forms of official ID. So that might be your driver's license, or that might be some type of card related or similar to a driver's license. But then a second form of official ID might be something like a passport, where a lot of underrepresented populations or working class populations don't have a second form of official ID. So it becomes a form of discrimination. Longer lines, the availability of casting a ballot in person as opposed to absentee, what that looks like, a universal ballot, universal mail-in ballot as a provision of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That would be a huge component for going forward. You also have the ability of what happens for other groups that may be disenfranchised, which tend to be not just underrepresented groups of color, but also those of lower working class, those that are working for a living, students, younger people, all these types of elements that limit, if you will, for Republicans, Democratic participation rates, particularly in those states that are perennial targets or battlegrounds like Florida, like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. All of that churning up underneath for what can happen. So that's why voting rights legislation is a huge deal. The problem is the Biden administration doesn't seem able to get it past the starting line. And with a 50-50 Senate, with those two senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kristen Sinema of Arizona, they're not going to deliver, which means Republicans only need those two or one vote on, of that to prevent what's going forward. That's going to be the hard sell for the Biden administration.
Again, the likelihood of this bill passing is slim at this point. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell arguing that this is a federal overreach into state-run elections. But Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that the vote will go on. Two Democrats, Arizona Senator Kristen Sinema and West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, vowed to vote no. Why would they back away against their party push?
All right, so Joe Manchin is interested in negotiating for other elements, particularly like in Build Back Better. Got to remember, too, that Senator Manchin represents West Virginia. West Virginia is a state that Donald Trump won by 37 points. He's a Democratic senator in a Republican state. Kristen Sinema is a little bit different animal here. Look, she's someone who wants to move forward on the legacy of John McCain, but she isn't John McCain. Moreover, she's talked about being in favor of these two large voting rights changes, but she doesn't want to change the filibuster, again, negotiating something else. She's also a Democrat who's front and center in a state, Arizona, that represents the advent of the modern conservative era. When Barry Goldwater loses the 1964 presidential election, that gives rise to Ronald Reagan, the modern conservative movement, a whole host of, if you will, of symbolic politics to the right. So she's on borrowed time. Joe Manchin's worried about being on borrowed time. And this drives Democratic voting rights activists they drives them crazy because they want to see some movement and they don't want two senators holding up the majority of Americans that favor such legislation and the majority of the Senate that favors such legislation. This also gives House Democrats pause and places pressure on Nancy Pelosi and the leadership team there because Democrats in the House want to advance lots of legislation and make it hard for the Senate to say no. All of this riding on the Biden legacy with that midterm election in the background, hugely problematic as we move closer and closer to November 2022.
Schumer added that the public has a right to know where their elected officials stand at this moment, so he's trying to get senators to go on the record with their decision, hoping that may sway them in favor of voting for the bill. So will this work, and what can we expect from the vote tonight?
Yeah, I think that what we'll see from the vote tonight is you're going to have to change the filibuster rules. Democrats have to remain whole in terms of having those 50 votes to advance this legislation. We're not likely to see that because of the public persona that Joe Manchin's taken, because of the public position that Kristen Sinema's taken. And that's exactly correct. We do have a right to know where our senators and where they stand. The difficulty is going to be parsing out this legislation. If this technique moves to go to what's called a talking filibuster, that will then lead to Chuck Schumer and other Democrats mulling doing the same thing to carve out elements of Build Back Better. Because right now, the Biden administration agenda, not just voting rights legislation, but all of their legislative package hinges on these changes related to what happens really tonight and moving forward. That could also affect any future Supreme Court nominees. That could affect judges. There's a whole lot riding on this procedural change and what will come after this. But right now, we expect some futility for Democrats to get any voting rights legislation passed, as symbolically and substantively important as that is for our nation and our democracy.
That can be very frustrating with U.S. politics when we see how much is stuffed under one bill and then it tends to fail because of the various, passages that they're trying to push in that one bill. So let's see what happens in the future with that. Thank you so much, Dave McCuan from Sonoma State.
Thank you very much, Ella, for having me. Have a good day.